Gayathri, Iyer to this talk as speaker today. I'll just give a very brief introduction. So Gayathri is an art historian, dance historian, and Bharatanatyam dancer. Her research looks at the intersectionality between performance and sculpture in Indian art. She's completed a master's in arts and aesthetics, which was an integrated program that looked at visual arts, theater and performance, and cinema. She's also completed an MPhil in Indian art history and is currently doing her PhD in JNU on temple sculpture. She's completed grants which was funded by the India Foundation for Arts, which looked at the dance history of Bangalore. She's also consulting with INTACH on inscriptions of Hoysala heritage sites on UNESCO World Heritage Site list. So I'd like to invite you to keep your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Smriti, and a big thanks to both NIAS and INTACH for inviting me to be a part of this brilliant series of speakers, and I hope I can contribute something this evening. Before I start, I would also like to thank INTACH, specifically Meera ma'am, for thinking of me, because one of the ideas behind putting this talk together was some of the work that I'm doing with INTACH just now to help with granting the Hoysala heritage sites UNESCO World Heritage status. And so that is sort of how my engagement with the Hoysala sites has deepened. But let me just start this presentation. So I know that the title of my talk is The Art and Architecture of Karnataka. And of course, I've specifically mentioned that I'm looking at the Chalukyas and the Hoysalas. But this is a sort of deceptive title. The Art and Architecture of Karnataka is quite vast. And the Chalukyas and the Hoysalas are actually two individual and unique periods of time in what is otherwise a continuum. And I want to clarify a little bit as to why I chose these two seemingly try and understand and isolate those characteristics. So of course, I'm not saying that there isn't other beautiful architecture in Karnataka. There absolutely is. This is the lovely temple tank at the Boganandishwara temple in Devanahalli. If any of you have been here, you'll know it's a beautiful, large temple. And similarly, of course, there's the entire contribution of the Vijayanagara Empire that I do not leave unnoticed in my work. But the reason I chose these two specific dynasties is because when we look at, for example, Pattadakal, pictured here, it's an 8th century site. And in the span of 500 years, we get from this to this. And my question is, how can we understand that span of 500 years? What happens? What is the aesthetic sensibility that's changing? And it's important to mention here that art historians see this evolution from this point to this point as linear. They see it as a form that begins as a concentrated idea and then expands with time, elaborates with time. And while I agree that at a superficial level that is true, I still ask the question, what is different about the way these dynasts approach space, embellishment, and movement? And in asking these questions, I hope that we're able not just to get answers, because I think the pursuit of history is not about answers, but the pursuit of history is nuance. And so I hope I'm able to add some of that today. So again, I will split this presentation up into sort of 3 subcategories or subtopics. I will start with landscape and the engagement of nature. I will move on to the use of space and the idea of embellishment. And I will conclude this presentation by looking at the notion of movement. So when we think about the landscape of where a temple is situated, and I will be looking primarily at Badami here, Badami and Pattarakal, a little bit of Aihole, but on the Hoysala side, primarily at Somnathpura, Belur, and Halebedu, because these are the more prominent sites. So if we look at Badami, so right here, we are standing at the sort of ledge that's just outside Cave 2 in Badami, and we are sort of looking out at the lake. Across the lake, you can see a cliff, and on top of that cliff, to the leftmost side is the upper Shivalaya of Badami. If we go down the lake, we have the Bhutanatha temple, and the entire temple complex of Badami is concentrated in this area because the city of Vatapi was, of course, the fortified citadel of the Chalukyan rulers. And why this space is really important is because the natural rock forms that you see, so I'm talking about these rock forms here. The natural rock forms that you see actually create an interesting space in the citadel of Vatapi. They surround the citadel on 3 sides. And so therefore, anybody who's conquering the city of Vatapi or who wants to attack will have to climb over the mountain and therefore will be caught right away by the Chalukyan imperial guards. And so the rock itself creates an interesting architecture or structure in the space. But more importantly, if we look at the actual temples, and as you see here, this is one of the caves. I believe this is cave 1. You can see that it is rock cut architecture where the rock is cut in, it's not cut out. So what I mean by that is there's the rock is removed from the site. It is not sculpted out of the site. And so I have been thinking about this quite a bit, and I keep thinking about what it means when you cut a temple into a piece of solid rock. And after reading a lot of Phyllis Granoff's work and a lot of Dr. Michael Meister's work, who are great art historians and Indologists and who talk about the notion of the temple and the purpose of the temple, it becomes apparent through their work that the idea of a temple spire or a vimanam or a shikhara, if you're in North India, the idea of a temple spire is to represent a mountain, right? So in Greek mythology, it was Mount Olympus. In Hindu mythology, it's Mount Meru. And there are several Puranas that delineate in great detail what Mount Meru was. It was a celestial abode where gods lived and demigods lived and ganas lived and gandharvas and apsaras. And it was a celestial world of sorts. And at the very, very top of this world is where salvation rests, right? Or where salvation is attained. And that's why at the very, very top of a temple spire, we have an amlaka or a kalasha if you're in South India. And when we are looking at these cave temples, we're looking at the earliest versions of built temple architecture. And therefore, the rock is used quite literally as the mountain itself. And that also puts into perspective a few ideas about what temple architecture is in its relationship with nature, but also what it means in the larger scheme of a dynasty's legacy. So when you go to the cave temples at Badami, you'll find, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but you'll find that the notion of architecture is indeed very specific. It is trying to mimic a structural temple instead of a monolithic temple. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the pillars up front, you'll see that they are actually not supporting anything, because the rock exists in its natural form. Those pillars are not required for weight-bearing support. But they do add this notion of a structural temple. And so we'll talk more about this later. But also to realize that the Badami temples are utilizing quite literally what they have and incorporating those elements into the architecture. So they are going with the grain, if you will, instead of against the grain. And in complete contrast to this, we have the Hoysala rulers, who, as you can see here, this beautiful landscaped garden just around the temple, of course, is done by the ASI. But you can look just in the distance here at what the closest space for obtaining rock would be to build the structure, and how removed as such and how freestanding the structure is by itself. Similarly, if we look at Belur, it's the same thing. You have an aerial shot of Belur here. And just beyond here, I think, towards the back, there are some mountains. But if you look at the way the structure is designed, it's independent as such. It is decidedly freestanding and also designed to create a different kind of impact than a rock cut monument, or even a simple structural monument that's built out of sandstone. So when we're looking at landscape, the unity with nature is obviously one aspect of it, but the unity with space is the other aspect, the use of space, the idea of what an empty space can do and what it can make us do. So when we think about the architecture of the Chalukyas, of course, I've just listed the prominent sites here for all of you to get a sense of where to go to really look for these monuments. But more importantly, I would like to talk about what the key components of cave architecture are when we talk about the Badami Chalukyas. So George Michel, of course, a great scholar, he observes that the high point of 6th century rock cut architecture is, in fact, or are the caves of Badami. And we were talking about this idea, this notion of a colonnade being a structural element which is incorporated into cave temples. And now that we're a little bit closer, we can see the temple a little bit better. I encourage you also to see here the use of brackets, right? This inclusion of brackets. Again, these brackets have no real purpose or function other than the aesthetic function. And each of these brackets is sculpted. And not just sculpted in a way that is superficial or shallow, but actually sculpted in the round, meaning that these are three-dimensional figures that hang above us as we walk through the space. And there are these huge life-size sculptural panels at either end of the cave. As you can see here, this Vaikunta Vishnu is quite famous and is about, I would say, 7 to 8 feet tall. The hood of the snake will be about 7 to, I would say, about 8.5 feet tall. And we then also realize that in Chalukyan cave architecture, the inner mandapa and the way in which the space is used is very unique. So a good example of this is the triple bayed panel opening, which exists in Aihole. And when we look at this particular sculpture, this is the very, very famous Ravanpadi cave at Aihole. And this particular Nataraja, again, is very interesting. There are many, many interesting Badami Natarajas, but this is one of the more interesting ones. we notice, first of all, that the figure has been framed by these two pillars. Mind you, these pillars are also rock cut. They haven't been added later. And the space, the gap between the pillar and the sculpture, and I've actually stood there and tried to put my hands on either wall, my elbows still remain bent. So I would say that it's no more than 2.5 feet in width. Yet the sculptor has sculpted so, and if you can see here, the extent of the shadow, the sculptor has sculpted the Nataraja so deep into the wall that this snake, which is coming like this and hanging over here, looks as though it is three-dimensional. Looks as though it's coming out of the wall. And the sculptor has managed to do this in this tight a space. Standing in this 2.5 feet of space, the sculptor has managed to carve this entire panel, as well as these side panels, which are also, if you can see the depth of the kiritas, are also practically three-dimensional figures. You have arms and legs that are protruding from the side sculptures as well. But what's more important about this sculptural panel is how space and framing is used. So if you look at these two columns here, you will notice when you stand there, and of course you'll have to go to Aihole to experience this, but as you sort of walk away from the panel, you'll notice that the frame tightens. And as you walk closer, the frame widens. And this is, of course, a very common optical technique used by several temple sculptors across India. But what I find interesting is that if you notice this weapon right here that Shiva is holding, it aligns almost perfectly with the pillar to create that frame for us. And that's the great, to me, the great fascination of Chalukyan cave sculpture is the precision with which it's done, and the realistic nature of the essaying of the limbs as well. Even this particular arm looks as though it is outside the wall. It does not look like it's carved into the wall. And that's the great contribution, I think, of the Chalukyan sculptors. But of course, figural sculpture is one thing, but it's also very important to look at the idea of architecture and structural elements as being key contributions of the Chalukyan rulers. So to that end, we have, of course, these four main sort of ways of appreciating architecture. We have columns, we have brackets, we have beams, and we have ceiling panels. So columns are very interesting because there are certain scholars who believe that there are textile designs that are present in each of these column designs. But if you look closely, what I have noticed is perhaps there's also some sort of a reference to jewelry. And you notice that in this particular molding, where you see there's graduating beads that become larger, there's a pendant, and then there's graduating beads on the other side. So I asked the question, could this have been a necklace of some sort, or could it have been a decorative garland that had a very specific purpose? We don't know. But what we do know is that this motif of ducks is very, very important to South India because we see it in the Pallava realm as well. Examining columns in cave temples is always an interesting endeavor because as we discussed earlier, they are just there for aesthetic purposes. I don't believe that they have a weight-bearing function, but the variety in these columns is just simply stunning. So here we have a column which looks, if you look at the top part of it, so this part of the column, this part, it looks like the round part of an amlaka. It looks like the round part of a North Indian temple spire crown, right? The top part of a North Indian temple. And underneath that, it's almost as though the rib designs here is like fabric that is being cinched by this band of ornamentation, by this embellished band. And to be able to execute something like this in stone is, of course, beyond what we can think about today. Similarly, this particular column is interesting because it follows the basic principle of a shakari temple. So what that means is, if you have a basic form, like the column in this case, if you cut that form in half and attach the halves to either side, and cut that further in half and attach the halves, and cut that further in half, and therefore the form expands, as you can see with this column. You have this as the base element, then this is one half and another half and another half, and this tiny half in front. It makes for a very interesting geometrical design and a formula of expansion, which not only adds variety to the temple space, but also makes for an interesting way of understanding other styles of architecture. Now, we'll talk about this in a moment, but the great legacy of the Chalukyan rulers was the fact that they drew from a large range of inspiration in terms of their architecture. So when you go to Pattadakal, you do see, for example, traditional Dravida style monuments. You also see Nagara style monuments. But it's interesting to note where all these influences sort of exist. Now, if we look at Aihole, and you look at these brackets are very specific brackets. They could be Makara or Matsya brackets. There could be the brackets of the alligator or the crocodile. But what that does is it draws your eye upward to the sculpted ceiling and to the grandeur of the space. And speaking of sculpted ceilings, the figural depictions were very, very important to the Chalukyan rulers. And this particular sculpted ceiling panel is from Cave 3 in Badami, and makes for an interesting way of using space that is more than just on the horizontal plane, that it is a usage of space on the vertical plane as well. And I think that that sort of adds a different dimension to the idea of worship also, because if you're worshiping and you're looking straight, at which point in time do you look up to look at the ceiling? And in which point in time do you look left? And in which point in time do you look right? So the truth is that these are devalayas, right? They're houses of God. So when we go in, every surface is embellished to give us the notion of a cosmic space, of a divine space. And so just to sort of recap here, some of the points I was saying earlier about this notion of Dravida and Nagara. So it is true that the earliest South Indian style temples that we find are found in Chalukyan territory. But George Michel, again, I've referred to him earlier, claims that the Dravida style was an export of the early Chalukyan architects, and that the Nagara style comes in much later. And so, of course, the natural historical explanation for this is because the Nagara style involved the Chalukyan rulers traveling, conquering different territories, and bringing back sculptors from those territories. So my PhD guide, Dr. Namana Huja, very affectionately refers to Pattadakal as a temple theme park, because sometimes it serves as a really interesting display or an exhibition of all of the different temple types that could have existed in the 7th and 8th centuries. So now moving on to the Hoysalas. What is interesting about the architecture of the Hoysalas is that while there are more than 250 Hoysala sites, three of them really get all of the attention, which is unfortunate but understandable. Because of the 247 sites that remain, we find that a handful of them are really embellished, but most of them are not. And most of them don't carry the sort of high art sophistication that these three carry. Now, any art historian worth their salt will disagree with this, because all of these temples are beautiful in their own ways. But from a very technical and outwardly superficial way, a superficial perspective, these would be the three most important ones. And therefore, I will draw on these three the most, because those of us who live in Bangalore are very, very familiar with these three sites. So again, if we could go through the key components of the architecture here, I'm going to go through exactly the same 4 subheadings: columns, brackets, beams, and ceiling panels. And the columns in Hoysala art, unlike the columns in Pallava art, have a very different visual purpose. So while the columns in Chalukya art would radiate, like how we saw the Shekri column I was telling you about with the square, you notice this column in the middle, it also radiates. One cannot disagree that it radiates, but it radiates in the form of a spiral, right? There's something explosive about the radiation of this particular column rather than measured. And that really is sort of the way I would encapsulate Hoysala art in a word. I would call it explosive. This pillar right here is very, very important because it is an emblematic lathe turned pillar. So meaning that if you notice the smooth edges here, it could have been turned on a lathe, right? Which is a machine that rotates the pillar really fast. So there are no sharp edges, so that there's a smooth circular and cylindrical shape to it. And on top of this lathe turned pillar, you have these hand carved embellishments that are really of superior quality. Now, this is a temple in Belur, and again, you can notice the variety in pillars. So you have one heavily sculpted pillar back here, a simpler lathe-turned pillar here, a sort of radiating star-shaped pillar here. And then this seems to be some sort of a composite between a ribbed, fluted colonnade and a star-shaped pillar. And this seems to be somehow more squarish in the way that it expands outward. So variety is the key to Hoysala art, really, because no two are identical. Now, this is just to give you a cleaner example of what a lathe-turned pillar is. So this is from Amritapura. And if you look at the lathe-turned pillars here, you can see these little flecks of light that you see that are being reflected are indications of exactly how smooth the stone has become from being turned on the lathe. And therefore, the chloritic schist, the stone that's being used, reflects the light and takes on this sort of almost like an illuminated path, right? It takes on a sort of very different aesthetic register, if you will. When we come to brackets, we think about brackets, of course, as purely architectural elements. But the Hoysala artists did not think about brackets that way. And if you notice, you have a half lathe turned pillar here with a bracket coming out of it. And upon the bracket, this gorgeous sculpture, right? So there are all these gorgeous sculptures of women. Some of them are dancing, some of them are looking into mirrors, playing instruments, talking to parrots. So this sculpture, of course, is the famous Shalabanjika. And if you notice in this sculpture, you can see it a bit clearly. This is where the bracket attaches to the top. There is a stone piece that comes down behind her and creates the bracket as such. So when we think about brackets also as architectural elements, uh, we need to be thinking about whether architectural elements are the places that we can express our creativity. So if I was a dynast, would that be the place that I would put a sculpture? Or would it be, would I keep my focus to the larger idols? And there's no right and wrong. It's all about what is the sensibility? What is the sensibility with which the sculptor and the dynast is approaching the structure? Similarly here, if we talk about beams, you have the ceiling panels here, which actually have layers of being sort of impressed into the structure. So you have layer 1 here, and then layer 2 here, and then there's a layer 3 here at the top, if you can see. So it almost goes up like almost like a cone, like a Vimanam inside. And why this is important is because the structure as such rests on a grid. Unlike the Chalukyan cave temples or the Chalukyan structural temples, which don't actually have a grid format, but have more of a colonnade format, these temples employ this grid structure with these square sort of conical impressions that go into the ceiling. And it also makes us ask the question, which of these is functional and which is embellished? And that's a great joy of studying the art of the Hoysalas. Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you don't know what is structural and what isn't. But these are obviously very, very structural. These beams just here. But this embellishment here is purely celebratory, is the idea of filling the divine space with a design. When I went to visit Baylor with one of my students, she pointed out to me that this looks like a door. It looks like a temple door. And we looked at it a little closely, and she felt that way because there were nuts and bolts here. And I often wonder if at all this was a door. So we looked at, for example, the Chalukyan ceiling panel, which was embellished, which had a lot of figural depiction. But this particular embellishment is not figural, right? It is an embellishment of motifs. And when we look up and we see a door, my question is, if we had to think in the way that the Chalukyan or the Hoysala architect was thinking, where is that door leading? And this is always a very interesting exercise to do with students of art history or anybody who you're traveling with. If you have an instinct that there is a portion of the temple that looks like something familiar, ask yourself what it is and why it could be put there. Because oftentimes what we recognize as motifs today actually have a very strong past and a very strong visual history that is worth tracing and sharing. So this particular ceiling panel is a very good example of how Hoysala rulers like to embellish their ceilings, not just rulers, but ministers as well who commissioned architecture. And the Hoysala sculptor was a master of variation, as I said earlier. So just to sort of summarize the architectural style very succinctly, Hoysala temples are often three-shrined, although there are exceptions to this. They follow a cruciform ground plan. They have pillared halls, and of course the lathe-turned pillars are very important. And then of course the last question is, because we talked about Nagara and Dravida when it came to Chalukyan art, the last question is, can a Hoysala temple be classified as Nagara or Dravida? We do know that, for example, some Hoysala temples do have these sort of very tiny kalashas atop them, but these kalashas don't look traditional in the way that they would look, for example, in Tamil Nadu. So the question is the Hoysala style a Nagara style? Is it a Dravida style? Is it neither? Is it, can we call it something else? Can we call it a Vesara style? Vesara is when you take elements from North India and South India. although the term Vesara is very problematic because it doesn't serve as a codified order of temple architecture. And so in answering this question, I think I would like to flip it back and question the question itself. Why do we adhere to these arbitrary notions of Nagara and Dravida? There are identifiable characteristics of North Indian, South Indian temples, absolutely. But perhaps these are just guidelines that serve as a roadmap to inspiration as such for South Indian sculptors. And the Hoysala style becomes an ultimate expression of that, of creativity infused into that roadmap. And so therefore I do feel uncomfortable calling it a strictly Dravida temple, and I do feel uncomfortable calling it anything else. So I think that it's important to start recognizing styles of architecture that don't strictly fall into boxes that we create as art historians or as architectural historians. And so I would just like to conclude the space portion of this presentation by talking about this doorway in Belur, which is the most emblematic Hoysala doorway that you can ever see. You have the half lathe turned pillars here and here. You have the brackets up top. You have the Dwarapalas, and you have this beautiful carved, embellished gateway. About 70 or 80 years ago, when several Western explorers, scholars, historians came to visit India, they saw this temple and many temples like it, and they used the term horror vacui to describe the Hoysala aesthetic. Horror vacui quite literally means a fear of empty space. And their contention was that all of this embellishment that you see is elaborate because the Hoysalas were afraid of leaving any space uncarved. Now, of course, the world has developed quite a bit since then. And we don't see, most art historians don't see this as horror vacui anymore. But what we do see is that there's a range of designs that perhaps would have been incorporated in textile, in jewelry, in other kinds of sculpture and other media, like wood, for example, that exist in these embellishments. And so it is going to take us another couple of lifetimes to study each of these motifs and to figure out why it is that the Hoysalas wanted to embellish their temple walls and their walls in general with such detail. And the last part, I think I have about 10 minutes or so. I think the last part of this presentation I'd like to talk about is my favorite, of course, which is movement. Now, these are the Vimanas at Somnathpura. And when we look at these Vimanas, of course, you can see this Kalasha up top, which is not a pointed Kalasha, by the way. We look at this shape, this idea, this notion of angle as a fractal, actually, as sharp, as distinct, as deliberate. But Adam Hardy, the great architectural historian, introduces us to the concept of the aedicule in Hoysala architecture. So what does that mean? So we see these two tiny gopurams here that are etched on stone. And so his idea is that that gopuram is the basic unit of which the entire structure is designed. So 2 gopurams make a bigger gopuram, and 4 bigger gopurams make an even bigger gopuram. And therefore, the architecture is amplified exponentially based on how many gopurams are included. So if you look at this image, you can see here that there are slightly bigger gopurams than what we saw a moment ago. And all of those come together to make this large structure. But how is this structure right here, this set of temples from the patriarchal complex, how are these different from this? And the first thing that we notice is that this doesn't have as many sharp edges, right? So whereas this has a lot of sharp edges that come at you, this doesn't. But can we understand the concept of the ADQ here? Is it possible? So I know we do have some motifs here that look like they're resonant with motifs here. But the mode of expansion in this sort of a temple is not exponential, right? The mode of expansion in this sort of temple is different, but how is it different? So when we look at the Malagiti Shivalaya, again, a temple in Badami, we don't notice any sort of difference in the way that the edges look. The sharp edges don't come at us. But what we do notice is a gradual progression of the roof. So we start at this level, we move to this level, and then we end at this level. And when you look at the temple, the Mallikarjuna temple in Pattadakal from this angle, it almost looks like you're ascending a mountain. Again, going back into that trope of what a mountain is and what a mountain means to the Hindus. And as you ascend the mountain, you're met at the very, very top with this little architectural element. This is called a stupika. So those of you who've studied Buddhist architecture, you know a stupa is a semicircular dome-like structure which is used for worship. This is a stupika, and it's topped with a kalasha. And perhaps the progression into this temple is not one of expansion and explosion like the Hoysala temples, but one of ascension, right? Where you have an angle where you're climbing to the top. And this is confirmed when we look at the edge of the temple, that there are almost no sharp angles. And I agree that, erosion and time may have contributed to the fact that some of these angles have reduced in their pointedness, but it just doesn't have the energy of an exploding star like the Hoysala structures would. And perhaps this is trying to give us a very different genre of divine experience than that is. So again, as we stand here, we look at each of these sculptures that is etched into the face of this exploding star, of this fractal. And each of these corners is coming at us quite aggressively, right? But these aren't. And again, it's not an idea of good or bad. It's just an idea of difference, right? So what I'm trying to do is highlight different aesthetic sensibilities. But one of the most enduring notions of movement in these spaces is dance. And when we walk into the Hoysala space, we are confronted instantly with these beautiful dancing women that are in brackets all around us, almost looking down at us. This particular sculpture from the Chennakeshava temple in Belur possesses a sort of grace. All the dancers out there know that this position of the foot, this front-facing angle, is very unique and interesting, because normally speaking in classical dance, we turn the foot all the way to the side. This front-facing angle actually gives you a little bit more balance, but doesn't allow for the full turning out of the knee. And I thought about it. I said, why is it that this knee is turned out entirely, but this one isn't? And what I realized is that the rhythm of the sculpture has a jali up here, which is quite busy and interesting. And it sort of comes down straight and instantly moves into a rhythm. So you have 1, 2, 3, right? Which is the Tribhanga posture. And the rhythm of this sculpture adds something to the space. There is a movement in the space. There's a dynamism in this dance. Similarly, here you have the sculptor making the knee completely outturned, like what we were talking about. But why this knee is completely outturned is because this elbow is also completely outturned. So there is a horizontal plane which the sculptor is trying to access. Again, you have 1, 2, 3, and you have this serpentine-like movement in the sculpture. Whereas here, you don't have an outward element here, you only have a frontal element, and therefore the knee has to face front. So this notion of movement and dance is actually very integral to understanding Hoysala sculpture. And it is said that perhaps sculptors, because they lived in the same neighborhoods as dancers did, as Devadasis did, perhaps they had access to looking at dancers dancing in real life and then making these sculptures as a result. Now, if we shift registers and we go back to Aihole, it's not like there aren't dancing sculptures there as well. There are. And I would like to talk about what is the nature of the dance here. So if you look at this sculpture, for example, you still have a sinuous Tribhanga posture. You have 1, 2, 3. You have a deflection of the hip. You have these beautiful wrinkles of flesh in the torso. And you have this uplifted foot, which is almost looks like it's about to be lifted. There's a tension and anticipation in the ankle and the calf here. And I would also like to draw your attention to the knees, the way the sculptor has depicted the knees in this sculpture. But why is the movement of this sculpture very different than the movement of the Hoysala sculpture? So let's take another example. This is my absolute favorite sculpture from Badami. It is the famous 16-armed Nataraja. And those of you who have seen any of my talks before, I always like to include one slide on this sculpture, because any two hands from the left and right, if you put them together, they do create a dance posture. And notice the dimensionality of how these hands come out of the wall. You can actually put your hand in between, inside or in between his hand and his body. And that is the extent to which the sculptor has carved the statue. So think about how they have to do this. So they're starting with a flat piece of stone. So it is likely that he carved this hand first before sort of cutting into the rock and carving everything else. So it's almost like carving a sculpture backwards. But what's really important here is to notice this deflection of the hip, the turning out of the knee and the ankle, the lightness of this foot as though it's almost about to be lifted, and the balance of weight between the shoulder and the torso. Because there is a dynamism and a rhythm to Chalukyan dancing sculptures as well. Even in minor Chalukyan sculptures, like this Bringi sculpture, for example, notice here the deflection in his elbows, right? There is a distinct way in which the movement of dance is being injected into his body. Again, you notice a slight deflection in his hip, and then this sort of firm and stable stance of his foot. And of course, this famous Nataraja, which we've already talked about. So then the question is, what is really the difference? What is the difference in the movement between this Hoysala sculpture and these Chalukya sculptures? So notice first and foremost, the hip and the waist. This curve just here, which cinches the middle of the waist, is unfortunately a very unrealistic curve. If any of the men or women watching this have body shape like that, please do contact me, because I would be very, very interested in studying whether this is anatomically possible. As far as I know, it's not. So when we look at the waist here, we notice that the drama of this deflection of the hip exists to highlight both the chest and the hip. So the idea of creating this hourglass figure. Whereas here, you notice the hip sort of very gracefully and naturally turns into the waist without much drama. You have a few sort of ribs of flesh that exist naturally underneath the breast. But other than that, the curve and the movement in the figure is almost poised. It is not dynamic, if that makes sense. Whereas in this case, because of the sharp angles of the body, the tension in the lifted toe and the lifted second toe, you get the sense that this woman is dancing and we've caught her in the moment. But here, you get the sense that you've walked in on a scene where some women have been dancing. And there is a difference between those two. So notice the drama of the Tribhangi here and the sinuousness of the Tribhangi here. Again, it's not about right and wrong. It's about two different aesthetic sensibilities and registers. So when we talk about playing instruments as well, in the Chalukyan period of time, the majority of people who played instruments were ganas, were marginal figures, Gandharvas. But in the Hoysala realm, we do have main figures who play instruments. And by main, I don't mean, of course, the idols, but I mean these larger figures that embellish the space. And there's also seems to be a difference in the way instruments have been depicted. For example, this drum versus this drum. There's a dramatic difference because of how this is tied with string and fastened with a band, whereas this looks more like a sort of a mridangam or a dhol or a mardala. And Hoysala sculpture is, of course, known for its excruciating detail. And this pair of sculptures is no exception. If you look at the anklets, the silambu, which is a type of anklet, the type of jewelry, the jali, there is a need to make the sculpture lifelike, but then dramatize it to the point where it becomes almost unreal. It becomes inaccessible to us. And so with that, I would like to conclude. And I would like to say that we realized that between the Chalukyas and the Hoysalas, there were the Rashtrakutas, there were the Kalyani Chalukyas, there were 500 to 700 years of evolution. But can we appreciate both the Chalukya rulers and the Hoysala rulers for their difference in aesthetic sensibility, but the equivalence in their contribution to the art and architecture of Karnataka? And that's the question I'd like to leave you with, and open for questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayathri. I'm sure a lot of people who have not already seen these temples, even those who have, are lining up to make a beeline for those places because of the way you've described them and the way you've, your lovely, lovely photos. So we do have a lot of questions. I'll start with, I'll combine a couple of them. So there are a lot of questions which revolve around to what degree, if any, is there a correlation between the landscape, the nature of the rock or material available, and the architectural style or preferences? And if you could also just mention, you didn't talk about the stone that the Hoysalas used. There have been a lot of questions about that. So if you could just combine all this into one.
Yeah, so the Chalukyan rulers were building in sandstone. The Hoysala rulers were building in chloritic schist, which is a black soapstone, right? So it's a much softer stone. And that also begs the question, is it easier to carve details in black soapstone than it is in sandstone? The answer is yes, if you talk to a sculptor. And the reason many art historians believe that the Hoysala temples were quite so embellished is because of the access to the stone that they had. That being said, our ancient rulers had access to a lot of different things. If they wanted stone from somewhere else, they could have brought it. And therefore, it seems to be very deliberate that they make these choices that are both suited to the material as well as aesthetic choices. So in that sense, yes, the landscape does contribute, because the stone that you have closest to you is obviously the one that you're most likely to use. But there's several examples of temples across India where that's actually not the case, where people have brought granite from different places, or people have brought sandstone from different places to construct a temple. So
sorry, Gayathri, sorry. Can you just stop screen share, please?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So we can see you on screen. Yeah,
Better?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, so that's so I hope that answers the question, that landscape is important, material is important, but also access is, for kings like these who had access to a range of people from all over the world, resources were not an issue.
Okay. There's a question from Rane Kanyapan, who wants to know something about the tools that the Hoysalas used.
Okay, this is a very slippery slope. So I will not take this question. What I will do is I will direct you, please write me an email. I will direct you to an archaeologist who knows much more about this than I do, because the ways in which they talk about tools, especially when they talk about Hoysala art, is to look at grid markings and mason markings in the temples. And that is a very different and very rich area of study by itself. I am not an expert in that. I'm an art historian. So I can direct you to someone who'd be able to answer your question better.
And linked to this, there are a couple of questions about the lathe-turned pillars. Do you have something to say about that? Because, it's a controversy. Some people say it's not lathe-turned, some people say it is. So is there any evidence one way or the other?
Okay, so we do know that the notion of lathe-turned pillars actually comes from the later Kalyana Chalukya monuments. So the Kalyani Chalukyas were using this technique. Let's just call it a technique. So we don't know if it's a technology. They were using this technique in temples. And of course, this style of pillar also appears much later on in other temples across India. So yes, it is a controversy. No, I do not know whether there's a specific technological innovation that allowed this design to happen. But what I would say is this, that the Hoysalas made it popular and brought it to its high point in terms of what you can do with a design like that. I would say it's the Kakatiyas and the Hoysalas.
Okay. There are also some questions about the texts that were used by the Chalukyas and the Hoysalas. So some people are asking, like R.S. Krishna wants to know, were they actually conforming to any agamic texts? Somebody else wants to know, Satyamurthy wants to know whether they had any style guide, design guide, any such thing. And somebody else wants to know, for the Chalukyas in particular, did they have models that they worked on? Like, because they were so early, were there any other models that they followed?
Okay, wow, that's a lot. Okay. To start with, we do know that at some level they do have access, or they did have access to Puranic literature in terms of image making. So in terms of where they got inspiration to make their idols, we know that they had access to Puranic literature, because several of the idols that they make do conform to Puranic descriptions of these gods. In terms of the actual built structure, did they have a set of agamas or shilpa shastras? They definitely seem to have a set of shilpa shastras, because when I went in and I measured each of these Chalukyan sculptures, it ended up with the math that I did, that the ganas were tritala figures, and then there were chatushtala figures, and there were panchatala figures, and there were dashatala figures as well. So in terms of size and measurement, they seem to conform to a certain system that would have been widely accepted as part of the Shilpa Shastras, which is specifically the Talamana system, or the system of measurement. So I cannot necessarily tell you that they did prescribe to this specific Shilpa Shastra. I don't have enough evidence to say that. Perhaps another reading of George Michel and Michael Meister might answer that question. but I do believe that there was a system of measurement in place that seems to conform with the Shilpa Shastras. And there was one more question you asked me. It was
It was all linked. So, I mean, there was this thing about, did it conform to Aramaic? Did they have a text? And one person wanted to know about the Chalukyas. What models were they following?
What models were they following? Right. So a lot of Chalukyan sculpture is contemporaneous with Gupta sculpture. And we do see some very, very interesting parallels between early Chalukya and early Gupta sculpture, especially because not only are they contemporaneous in time, but they're also contemporaneous in thought. So we all know, those of us who study temple architecture, that the earliest built temple to still exist or to exist today that we can trace back is Bhitar Gaon, which is a Gupta period site, which was made of brick. And then, of course, Deoghar, which is a temple which still stands, the Dashavatara temple. And it's a very, very simple temple on a plinth. And when we look at that temple and we look at the Chalukyan temples, we see that even that early in time, they are trying to expand on the basic temple with a plinth. And we see this in structures like Malagiti. So are they seeing other sculptural traditions? Possibly, yes, because they're prioritizing similar kinds of things, but they're also making it their own by expanding in their own ways.
Okay. Uma Tanuku wants to know, how do the Aihole sculptures compare to the sculptures at Mahabalipuram? You touched upon this very, very briefly, but maybe you could say a little bit more.
So both just simply consummate examples of the skill and the vision of the Indian sculptor. So both the Pallava sculptor and the Chalukya sculptor are working with very strict notions of composition, framing, figural development, musculature, and ornament when they're sculpting both sets of panels. But the reason why I would give a half point more to the Chalukyan sculptors is because they incorporate pillars and architectural elements within the space. So when you go to the caves at Mahabalipuram, it's usually a large cave. So even if you go to the Varaha or the Mahishasuramardini caves, it is a large cave with about 2 pillars in front and maximum. And then you walk inside, and of course, the walls are sculpted profusely. But you don't actually have a framing device for any individual sculpture, which is something that you do find in Chalukyan caves. And that's what I find to be more complex, possibly more difficult to execute and interesting. So.
Okay. You spoke about the variety in Hoysala art and how you can't really, maybe you shouldn't be classifying this into a particular category, right? So Roshni has a question related to this. She says, was this a deliberate choice made by the artists and architects, or was it that they wanted to introduce a new style, or did they just want to show their skills in experimentation? So what do you think could have prompted the artists to do this kind of experimentation?
I think it could have been a little bit of all of those things. I think it could have also been the ability to actually carve that profusely because you have the material at hand to work with.
Mm-hmm.
But, I wish I could go back in time and ask. I don't have the ability. But what I would guess is that, no one wants to do what has been done before. And it is a myth for us to believe that any of these rulers would not have seen other types of monuments. I do believe a lot of them did see other types of monuments, or at the very least, acquired sculptors from conquered territories. Okay. So it's important for us to also realize that the Hoysala artisans are trying, I do believe they are trying to make a statement which is different from what already exists at the time.
Mm. So linked to this, Pranjal Shah has a question. He wants to know, are the Hoysala temples similar to the Marugurjara and the Mahagurjara styles when it comes to the ground plan?
Okay, that's a conversation for a completely different day. There are similarities, yes. But the nuance of those similarities varies based on the temple. So the Sarvato Bhadra, the basic cruciform floor plan tends to be constant in most Hoysala temples. But again, you would have to go on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Swati wants to know a little bit about the construction techniques. So particularly, were the sculptures carved, were the carvings done in situ or ex situ? What do you think?
That's, again, that's not an answer that I have ready made, but if I had to guess, because the Hoysala sculptures are signed, they are signed by the sculptor. And that's, of course, something I didn't get a chance to talk about in the scope of today's talk. Hopefully I can do another talk on that sometime. But I would guess that because of the weight of the stone and the type of the sculpture, I would guess that they were either carved in situ or in an atelier which was very close by. I don't think there was a lot of heavy transportation involved because soapstone is soft and fragile and it can break. And also there's several portions of the temple which, it seems that it would be impossible to carve those portions separately and attach them later. So it appears to me that, especially like if you think about the ceiling carvings and things like that, you really can't carve out a ceiling panel and then attach it, because if it breaks, then the carving makes it more susceptible to breaking. So my guess is that there would have been a sort of scaffolding type system, I suppose.
Okay. A few people have questions on the Hoysala Vimanas. So Shashank was asking how come many of them don't have Vimanas. So, I mean, obviously many of them have been lost, but maybe you could say, Namrata wants to know, is there an evolutionary pattern of Hoysala Vimanas? So maybe you could say a little bit about the Vimanas.
Yes, so some of them have been lost, which is very unfortunate, because if we had more of them, perhaps it would be easier to trace an evolution. But I do believe there is an evolution from Belur to Halebedu to Somnathpura. For me, there is a very, very clear evolution. And I think that there has to be, when we look at Hoysala temples, an orientation to understanding architecture that is both mathematical and literarily rich. So I think when we look at the Vimana, we can't just look at it as a form, which is, I think, where the question is coming from, is, can we trace the evolution of the form, which in other states of India is actually quite easy and quite possible to do this. But I think that with Hoysala Vimanas, the intention is different. It's not just about expanding, or it's not just about an evolution which is linear, but it's also an evolution which is trying to pack more information into a smaller space. So it condenses as it evolves, if that makes sense. And that's the sensibility with which we have to understand it.
Okay. I think this will be the last question, but it's a little long. So Siddharth Raja wants to know, how does the architecture of more localized kingdoms like the Nolambas and the Gangas, how does that fit into the continuum between the Chalukyas and the Hoysalas? And as an addendum, finish this.
No, I'll write it down.
Do we also see a little, how does the Vijayanagar art and architecture fit into this scheme?
That's an excellent question. So when we think about the sort of the local kingdoms of, the Nolambas, what I find interesting is you have many of these composite sites in Karnataka. So for example, the Boganandishwara temple, which I showed earlier, is a great example of this. You have something like 4 or 5 dynasties that sort of just end up packing everything in. And of course, Kannadigas are such lovely people. No one is going to destroy anything that anyone else built. So they all just keep adding. They keep adding to this monument. And you end up with an image or a situation where one portion of one temple belongs to one dynasty and another portion of the same temple, like the opposite wall, belongs to a different dynasty. And I think that when we think about expansion also within the isolated to sections, like in many ways you can in Tamil Nadu. So for example, you can say this mandapa was built by this dynasty. But when we talk about the Hoysalas and the Nolambas, and in several cases, the Vijayanagara rulers as well, there are actual singular structures that they have all contributed to in their own ways. So I think it's much more fruitful to understand the art and architecture of Karnataka as syncretic and not as fragmented, if that makes sense. So that's the first answer. And in terms of whether or not stylistic elements were incorporated into Hoysala art, the short answer is yes. For the long answer, please write me an email. And in terms of the Vijayanagara kingdoms, of course, they come much later, the Vijayanagara rulers. But we do see that there are very, very specific elements that are being drawn out from Hoysala art and incorporated into the Vijayanagara art and architecture, which again becomes a very syncretic style that has multifarious influences, including influences of Islam, including influences of Andhra Pradesh, including influences of Northern India. So I think we can't again understand it as, oh, the Vijayanagara style is this, or the Hoysala style is this. There has to be more of a continuum in the way that we understand these influences. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gayathri. Smriti?
Thank you, ma'am.
Smriti, would you?
Yeah, I want
take over.
So thank you so much, Gayathri. That was really, really